Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to talk about the symbolism of Saturn or Shani in Sanskrit as it pertains to Vedic astrology or Jyotish. And actually, before I begin the talk, I just wanted to thank everybody who's been supporting the channel and my work here, whether it's been subscribing to the channel or liking videos or leaving comments or sending some encouraging words. I just want you to know that it's all appreciated. So thank you for that. It keeps me going here. It seems like you guys want more, so I'll keep making more. All right, so note first, though, a few notes actually. The information presented here is for educational purposes only. It should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. So, all of my Jyotish or Vedic astrology teaching videos, which is this is one of them, are in my concepts playlist. So you can look for that playlist to find more teaching videos on astrology, Vedic astrology specifically. Also, you can check the planets Graha playlist for symbolism of other planets besides Saturn, because this is number 7 of 9, and I have Rahu and Ketu left to do, and I'll do them together in my next planet symbolism video. The other thing is that when I go through talks, if I ever put a double asterisk somewhere, that means that there's a teaching video for it. The other thing about this particular talk is as you go through it and you see the different photographs I've included, the different images, I would ask yourself, like, how is Saturn represented by each image? And just that exercise, kind of being more active rather than just kind of listening to me talk, which, is great in a lot of ways. But if you start to actively apply these principles to what you see, whether it's a photograph or whether it's in life, it'll help you build your intuition and it'll help you develop a relationship with Saturn or Shani. So, and that's really how this all kind of opens up for people if they really want to learn. So Saturn, Shani, Saturn Day or Saturday is the day of Saturn. Saturn is strong in the following position. So it owns or rules Capricorn or Makara and also Aquarius or Kumbha. So when Saturn is in those signs, it owns it. So it's going to feel at home and it's going to be very strong there. It's exalted in the constellation of Libra or Tula. So it's strong, as I mentioned, when it's in its own sign. That's called Swa position. It's also strong when it's retrograde or Vakri. And actually, right now, Saturn is Swa in its own sign in Aquarius or Kumbh, and it's retrograde. So Saturn is super strong right now. The other thing is that as the planets are moving, especially this month, most of the planets are going to either be in a sign of Saturn, or Saturn is aspecting different planets. So there's a lot of Saturnian energy right now. So a lot of the things that I talk about today are going to be playing out or showing up, even things like obstacles and delays and slowness and stuff like that. But it's also a rebuilding time. So you might not be cruising along, but you're essentially rebuilding infrastructure, which is all Saturnian stuff. Saturn also has directional strength or Digbala in the 7th house or Bhava, and that corresponds to the west direction and also 6 p.m. Thereabouts. Saturn is weak when it's debilitated or Nicca, and it's debilitated in Aries or Mesha. It's also weak when it's combust or Asta. And I have videos again on debilitation or combustion. If you're not familiar with those concepts, you can check out those videos. Also, when it's a planetary war loser, and all planets, whenever they're Sandhi or in the first or last degree of any sign, they're also weak. So Saturn relationships with other planets, it's friends with Mercury and Venus, it's neutral with Jupiter, and its enemies are Sun, Moon, and Mars. So what that means is when, for example, Saturn is in a sign of or constellation Mercury like Gemini or Virgo, it's going to be slightly stronger. When it's in a constellation ruled by Sun, Leo, for example, it's going to be slightly weaker. That's where friends and enemies comes into play. Qualities of Saturn, well, it rules things like sorrows, misfortunes, and suffering. It tends to have this energy of being harsh, hard-hearted, cruel. So it's very like no nonsense kind of planet. And that's why people don't tend to they tend to be afraid of Saturn. Saturn's pretty heavy duty. It's definitely not light and fun and airy the way Venus is. And I just did Venus, so this should be quite a contrast, this video, to my last planet symbolism video. But Saturn is still very important in many ways because it's all about infrastructure and building foundational things. So if it weren't for Saturn, things would be a lot more chaotic in some ways. So um, Saturn as elements is air, represented by air. Also, if you follow Ayurveda or traditional Indian medicine, it also represents things like Vata or wind conditions medically. So when you see, like right now, with Saturn being so strong in its own sign Swa, retrograde, it's also in a nakshatra or lunar mansion called Shatabisha, which translates as 100 healers. Medically, there's going to be a lot of Saturnian type things, and we'll get into medical things related to Saturn, but things like neuromuscular diseases. And also, I would say mood issues like anxiety, depression, feeling lonely, grief, that sort of thing. Um, Saturn as an energy is tamasic, which is more of a destructive energy, whereas the sun is sattvic, which is a building energy, and Venus is a Rajasic planet, which is a very active planet. Tamasic means that there's going to be a destructive quality or an inert quality to it. Saturn also represents neuter type of energy as opposed to a feminine or masculine type energy. It's neuter. And we're not talking about sex or genders, but like if we're assessing things like children, for example, we can look at different planets to see what the likelihood of having like a boy or girl is, that sort of thing. And Saturn is definitely a natural malefic. So if you want to know all about natural malefics and benefic planets, I have a video on that. So personification. So if Saturn was a walking, talking human being, um, how do we recognize Saturn? So Saturn is a servant. It's also a subordinate. It's very responsible, practical, constant, consistent type of person, to the point where they might almost be rigid, but they can be dignified if Saturn's in a positively well placed in a chart. People can be reserved, maybe religious, traditional, conservative, because again, Saturn is about kind of drawing back and kind of redoing, like replowing the ground, things. And so it's not like showy, flashy. Those are the opposite qualities of Saturn. Also, people are older or senior, people are sickly, people are poor, people are anxious, depressed, pessimistic. Foreign things can be represented by Saturn because Saturn represents things like outcasts. And foreigners are, in a sense, a type of outcast when they're in a different land than what's home to them. Service and manual labor, and trade. So Saturn is part of the Shudra caste. um, so that turning people tend to persuade through diplomacy, so reasoning. If Saturn is aspecting the Lugna, first house ascendant, rising sign, these are all different names for the same thing. People tend to either be fairly short or fairly tall, because again, that Vata quality, the wind quality tends to be very short. People tend to be short or tall. Also, they tend to wear, again, if this is just a stereotypical person we're talking about here, they would wear things like old, dirty, ragged woolen clothes. So things that are itchy, scratchy, not comfortable, not flashy, that sort of thing, but practical. Um, and as far as like a partner, like for example, if Saturn was aspecting the seventh house of partnership, spouse, that sort of thing, then there would be a tendency for the partner to be old, sickly, widowed, divorced, or foreign. So Saturn as a personification. All right, so a little bit about Saturnian or Shani like psychology. So people who have Saturn, especially me, well, it could be on the lugna, so the first house, because that does represent psychology, but also like the fifth house of intellect or the eighth house of deep psychology, or if Saturn is a dominant planet, or if there's a Saturn rising sign, then person may tend towards more of like being authoritative, disciplined, realistic, durable, consistent, persistent, stable, modest, mature, serious. That's their vibe. And potentially in more of a, which are all good things actually, because we definitely need some stable people on this. If you've been around a lot of unstable people, you'll definitely appreciate Saturn more. Um, on a negative side, though, people who are very Saturnian can also be inhibited or timid because they're so drawn back in their energy. They can be shy, isolated, stingy because they're like, holding on to, resources of different kinds. They can experience disappointment, loneliness, be resigned. So, because this sort of pessimism starts to roll out and affect their choices and outlook, lack of adaptability because, again, they can be rigid, they can be stuck in their ways, melancholic, a lack of trust, suspicious, doubt, fearful, shame, secretive, cruel. So when I think of Saturn, I kind of think of a Scrooge. Um, you know, like from what is it? Uh, I keep thinking of this cartoon, but when Christmas time rolls around, that older man who doesn't want to give any sort of charity and he doesn't give presents and he's just sort of, negative and says negative things. He's sort of like, get out of my face. That's kind of more the negative side of Saturn. Again, Saturn doesn't have to play it like that, but he can. So just so you recognize it when you do see it. So professions that are very Saturnian, so things that require physical exertion, jobs that require bearing burdens. So, tough, long, enduring, definitely not easy breezy peasy. Dealing with servants, civil servants, politics, bureaucracy, because you have to have persistence to work through all that red tape, government, to get things passed through. You have to have endurance because it just doesn't happen overnight. You have to work through all those levels of bureaucracy to get things done. Also, rogues can be low class people, thieves, cruelty. So this is more the negative side of Saturn. Disciplinarian, so you can be on that side of it. You can either be breaking the rules or making the rules. The chronically ill, stones, wood, cement, minerals, oil. So when you start to use these sort of natural mineral materials of the earth, that can be Saturnian metal dealers, worn or broken things. So this is more the destructive aspect of Saturn. Industrials, manufacturing. So all the machinery um, involved in like a factory, that's all Saturnian. Um, base avocations, ruckers, so people who destroy things, night workers, so they work at night, so they're kind of displaced or isolated from mainstream society just by a time displacement. Sculpture because it's structural. Butchers, leather workers, because that involves death, and Saturn does indicate death sometimes in certain conditions. So just because you see Shani somewhere, don't assume it's death. It can be these other things, but potentially can. Executioner, mortician, cemetery. So again, things that are related to death. Things below the ground, like miners, drillers, and again, the natural mineral resources associated with that, which I mentioned before, like oil and stones and stuff like that. Roots, fruits, because those are mm, foods that are, well, at least roots are below the ground. Spoiled food, because it's been altered in a negative way. Excavator, so people are digging the earth. Old people, old things, historians. Also renunciants, monks, ascetics, of people who isolate from the world, withdraw from the world, or they're, I guess today we would call them minimalistic. Like they don't want a lot of extra fluff. It's just very efficient, very bare bones, that sort of thing. It tends to be their style, and kind of mannerism and kind of way of living. People who are homeless or poor, outcasts, foreigners, I mentioned, people involved with trash, recycling, sanitation, people who carry secrets, like maybe spies, maybe police, land and real estate, because Saturn also is a Bhumi Karaka, or a planet that symbolizes land, efficiency experts, and then we get also scientists, engineers, and um, medical people, because there's, especially nowadays, and we're talking more kind of modern Western medicine, because there's so much science, right? There are all these machines and gizmos, and there's a and chemicals and things like that, that are manufactured rather than using plants, rather than kind of more. It depends. It can go either way. So if we're talking about something like Ayurveda, Saturn might show up because Ayurveda is traditional medicine. Um, but I actually tend to think more of things like Jupiter for Ayurveda, um, because Jupiter is more of a healing type energy, whereas Saturn, Sun, Mars can be more of, like, again, the more chemical, biochemical model, biophysic model, that sort of thing, biomechanical model, as opposed to more biological and more energetic sort of thing. So it can go either way with Saturn. So you have to take it in context with other things. All right, so what about Saturn and different illnesses? Well, Saturn represents things like the skin, the thighs, the upper legs, specifically like knees to the hips, the colon. And so, because of the colon, things like flatulence and constipation, because flatulence and constipation are also signs of Vata. And again, Saturn is one of the most Vata planets. So, also things like joints, arthritis, rheumatism, posture, because we start getting into, again, the structure of the body, gout, that's involved with joints, and also is a building thing. So you start to form these crystals, uric acid crystals, and that's what forms what are called tophi. I used to actually work on a study where I used to measure tophi, which they look like mounds. Under the skin, because crystals are building up there. And if these tophi get so big, actually the skin will split and you'll start to see the crystals coming out and stuff like that. So if it's really advanced gout, most people don't have that nowadays, but I've seen pretty advanced cases of gout, but that's a Saturnian thing. So things like teeth, hair, nails, skeleton, those are all structural. Things like stones, gallstones, kidney stones, again, structural, building things, and accumulating minerals, essentially, is what stones, biological, medical stones are about. Pain of all sorts, because again, you're dealing with the nervous system and muscles, typically paralysis, nerve disorders, um, because again, a lot of Vata type conditions have to do with the nervous system. So things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, especially because they're also these sorts of things, nerve conditions, also typically are also related with older age. Cramps, so that kind of contraction, cold contraction, that's a very Saturnian thing. Sense of touch in general, so issues with that, where the sense is too sensitive or not sensitive enough, that can be a Vata thing, or a Saturnian thing. Structural deformities, so maybe if there's a congenital birth defect, or if somebody had an accident and then there's a deformity left behind. So the accident itself would be Mars, typically, or K2. Um, Typically, those two planets represent accidents, but then, like, if there was like a shark attack or something like that, the shark attack would be like a Mars K2 type thing. And then like, if a limb was amputated, that the long-term chronic deformity that was caused because of the accident would be more of the Saturnian part of it. Coldness in general, because Saturn is a cold, distant planet, so things that are cold, as opposed to Mars and Sun, which are hot, fiery planets. Emaciation, so when the body starts to, again, just um, uh, catabolize, right? Start to break down because there's not enough energy to eat or food to eat or nutrition, that sort of thing, and the body starts to break down. That's Saturnian. Chronic illness, chronic fatigue, old age, atrophy of muscles and tissues in mind, weakness generally, osteoporosis. So the bones start getting weak and hollow, and then you can, fall easily and break because the bones are getting brittle. Anxiety, so more in the mind, anxiety, depression, grief, isolation, loneliness, stress, suffering. These are all Saturnian type qualities. And the tissues are the mamsa. If we're talking about Ayurveda and we're talking about tissues from that paradigm, we would be looking at mamsa and maju dhatu, so muscle and nerve tissue. The other thing is that, again, Saturn is related to things like mineral resources of the earth. So it could be involved in things like environmental disease. So if somebody works in a factory or in an environment where they're exposed to a lot of heavy metals or gases and things like that, because of the manufacturing output or side effects, then that can be a Saturnian thing. So that's something to consider. So places that are Saturn-like, places that are dirty, neglected, abandoned, lonely, slums, gutters, sewers, garbage. Also subterranean, we talked about being underground, basements, cellars, mines, that sort of thing. Also places related to death, like graves, cemeteries, inaccessible places. So again, this is where the isolation aspect of Saturn comes into play. But even if it's like a positive isolation, like a hermitage or ashram or retreat center, something like that. Also prisons, because they tend to be isolated. Hospitals, because you have sick people who are suffering, who have chronic illnesses, and they're isolated. So hospitals can be Saturnian. Also hospice care. So when people are unfortunately close to passing on, that would be a very Saturnian place. Homeless shelters, because people are displaced, don't have a home, are poor. Ancient ruins, because of the tradition and the longevity and the kind of semi-destructive quality of them. Also places like forests with water, and this specifically corresponds with Capricorn, and villages because that specifically corresponds with Aquarius, so the two signs or constellations that Saturn rules. And also stone buildings, because again, that land aspect. So when you see a stone building, think Shani. So flowers, foods, trees, animals related to Saturn. So the violet, sesame seeds, especially black sesame seeds and violet, because they're dark in color. Useless or ugly trees, so as opposed to floral trees or fruit trees or something like that. Um, Ones that don't seem particularly helpful. Um, Food that's difficult to digest, because foods that are difficult to digest typically cause gas, bloating, and increase vata. Um, so things like legumes, beans, that sort of thing, alfalfa, clover, beans, peanuts. So some of these things like peanuts, that's a tamasic type of food. So the energy of peanuts is actually to make the mind heavy. Because again, in Ayurveda, um, these qualities of sattvic, rajasic, tamasic apply to everything, including foods. And so some foods will actually dim the mind, and peanuts are on that list of dimming the mind. Soybeans, probably because they're hard to digest unless they're fermented and you make tofu or something out of them. Dark colored food, because again, dark colored it has this darker colors tend to have a sense of isolation, heaviness, gravitas, which is definitely Saturn. Rye, because it's a dark, heavy type of flour. Coarse food, because it's not refined. Old food, leftovers, impure, putrid food, so foods that are starting to go bad. These are all Saturnian because of that kind of like destructive, death-like quality. Junk food, because it's highly manufactured and less nutritious. Bitter herbs can be Saturnian. Salt, fermented foods like pickles, vinegar, like pickles, sorry. Because actually fermentation is a way of breaking the food down. Vinegar, I'm not exactly sure why. It's sour, but maybe it's also because it's acidic and it tends to break things down, and it actually can, in moderation, help to break down food and make it more digestible. Dry wines, because again, Saturn is a dry planet. Weeds, so things that people don't necessarily want to look at, right? Like, right? I mean, weeds by their nature, what you consider a weed is personal. So it's just a weed is something you want to pluck out of your yard. You just don't want to see it because it doesn't provide value, either aesthetically or nutrition if it's some sort of food that you're growing. Offensive foods like onions and garlic, because again, Saturn can be a bit offensive. It can be in your face, as opposed to Venus, which is all about, as I talked about in the last planet video, symbolism of the planet video. That's all about refined food and sweet food and nourishing, but also like seductive and fun food. That's all Venus, right? So it's the opposite of this. Tobacco, which again can be offensive. Also, tobacco maybe because when you're smoking it, and the nicotine and things like that. I mean, nicotine is very much like a Saturnian type of drug, where it affects the, constriction of the blood vessels and mood, and it's addictive. So, foreign foods, because again, in that foreign quality related to Saturn, astringent flavors, so things that are dry, and kind of make the mouth pucker up rather than make the mouth salivate. Minerals in general, as opposed to animals or plants related to Saturn, because again, all the earthy type qualities, right? Like even this bird here, and Saturn does represent birds. That is the one kind of animal it represents, like Mercury. But you have a little bird here on a pavement. So, two different ways that this photograph, at least two different ways. There are more, and that's for you to figure out of why this photograph represents Saturn. So time, distance, direction. So maturation period for Saturn is 36 years. The personified age of Saturn is somebody very old, so 100 years or older. The duration of Saturn is 69 to 108 years, so Saturnian things tend to last. Season of Saturn is, at least in the northern hemisphere, deep winter, 20th November to 19th of January. The length is 20 yojanas, which corresponds to 80 to 160 miles, which is fairly long. Again, if we're talking about, this paradigm of astrology being developed thousands of years ago, and the direction associated with Saturn is the west. So shape, color, gemstones, a window with four panes. That's the kind of shape or symbol related to Saturn. Color is black or dark blue. And gemstones and minerals and stuff like that. So I'll just mention briefly, but again, there is a note here to be cautious with using gemstones to balance planetary energy, because again, traditionally there's a whole rigmarole you have to go through, like what day you cut the stone and the day you place the stone in the setting, what day you wear the stone, mantras that are said, all this sort of thing. There's a whole thing about it. I don't know it, so I can't give you that information. So my teachers in astrology, Vedic astrology, actually suggested not to use gemstones because they can actually exacerbate planetary energies if you don't know what you're doing. And they always suggested things like doing mantras instead. But for people interested, at least a very basic thing, so that if somebody starts talking about blue sapphire, you'll know that that's a Saturnian gemstone. Whether you choose to use it or not, it's up to you. But iron and lead, again, we're not talking gold and silver here. That's not a very Saturnian type energy, as you're probably figuring out by now. But blue sapphire is really um, Neelam is the big gemstone for Saturn or Shani. And different alternatives for that can be lapis lazuli or blue spinel. Yeah, if blue sapphire is out of your price range. So that's Saturn. And so maybe now, as I mentioned, right now Saturn's very strong and it's aspecting many planets. And so you might see how Saturn is has infiltrated your life, especially if you happen to be running a Saturn Dasha, Shani Dasha, or Saturn planetary period right now. Then you'll see it even more. All right. So thank you for your time as always. Your time is appreciated. Your interest is appreciated. Again, all my teaching videos are in my concepts playlist if you're interested in that. I do personal birth chart readings on Zoom. So if that's of interest, you can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com. And I do have another YouTube channel called Nature Source Care. That channel is about other Vedic arts like Ayurveda and yoga, as well as homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. So if you're interested in natural medicines, that might be of interest to you. So until the next one, I wish you all the best and take care. Namaste.